So the majority of class today, we will be watching Act 2 of The Importance of Being Earnest. Hopefully you already watched and or read Act 1 because it's kind of confusing to start in Act 2 if you haven't already watched Act 1 last week. Let me share my screen here. Last week, Thursday, they called me in to help with testing, so I wasn't able to have class on Thursday. I know you were probably just crying about that, but you should have watched the first act, which is about 30 minutes of The Importance of Being Earnest. And I gave you a bunch of other things to kind of help you kickstart your understanding of that play. It's not a hard play to read or to understand when it's performed. The only struggle, I think, is understanding Victorian mindsets and kind of like fitting what Oscar Wilde's trying to do in the play into the, societal situation for Victorians. But I gave you some background. There's a couple of terms that, I kind of linked here. You should have looked over the PDF. And then we're going to continue today watching Act 2, but I'll do a little bit of review from Act 1 just to bring everybody together up to speed. I want to, before we start that though, I want to point out that we are slowly closing in on the end of the semester. We don't really have 6 weeks left in this course. We have 4 weeks left in this course and then the exam. So I just wanted to point out a few things for the ending here. The calendar has us working on The Importance of Being Earnest through Thursday. So we'll do Act 2 today, we'll do Act 3 on Thursday. Friday, we'll finish up whatever we need to from Earnest, and I'll also talk about, your progress on essay number 2. It's been about 2 weeks since I talked about essay number 2, and it's about 2 weeks until it's due. So if you haven't heard that, it's about 2 weeks until essay number 2 is due. And if you haven't started on it, you might want to do that. And so I'll talk about that a little bit this Friday. Also, discussion number 8 is due this Friday, and I'll talk about that in a second too. But when we get into May, the end of the term for STC is on the 14th. So we're going to have time to do some of the 20th century and modernism pieces, but then we sort of have to finish. And the final exam has a window here, just like we did for the midterm. So there'll be a window for the final exam. I do not intend to have any classes after Friday the 7th. That'll be the last day that we convene as a class. I don't expect to have any assignments, even though it's basically 2 weeks after the final exam until graduation. I'm not going to continue class after that. We don't have any more material. The exam's done. I don't see the point of meeting, for any considerable purpose. So usually this week, the week before graduation, is exams for seniors. They separate those from underclassmen because the graduates, they have to get their final grades. Most of you probably will already know that you're graduating, but there are some people who get surprised right around Wednesday the 26th, 2 days before graduation. They may find out that they're not graduating, that they didn't make their credits or have attendance issues or what have you. So not everybody knows immediately when they're graduating. I think the senior grades are due before the underclassmen grades too. But anyway, those 2 weeks, we're not going to be meeting. You can take care of your East classes and worry about those exams and all of that stuff at that point in time. I also took off discussion number 10, which had originally been put in for Friday the 7th and Monday the 10th. I just felt like it conflicted too much with the final exam. I know that you're heartbroken about that. So I apologize. You can take it out on me on the instructor evaluations if you want to. I'll understand. But I took that off. We're just not going to have time to do a discussion on the 20th century material. We ran out of time with that week that we had off, and I adjusted, but I just think it's too much to have the paper due on Tuesday, exam starting the final week, and do a discussion again on the 7th and the 10th. So I apologize if that messes you up too much. Sarcasm noted. In any case, today is about discussion number 8 and the importance of being earnest. So you'll have a discussion this week and one next week. Next week's will be the very last one that we have. So let me go over to the Blackboard. Let's look at discussion number 8. You should have already turned in 7. That one was due on Friday, and then the replies were due yesterday. So if you're behind on that, please take the time to go and, where's 8? Why isn't discussion 8 coming up for you guys on the discussion board? That's weird. I'm gonna have to go put that in. Here it is though. This week, the topic is about social ideas prominent during the Romantic period. So the idea here is, what do the people of the Romantic period seem to be concerned about in terms of their social issues and how their society is changing? So that's kind of a general concept. You can go back and look over the pieces that we read in the Romantic unit. So it's about, what do you think is changing, or what do they see as changing in their society? And then what threads can we connect from the Romantic period to our time today? What are some connections that we can make now that we're getting, a little bit closer to our modern era? Maybe there are some mindsets or some, ways of thinking, inventions, things that people were thinking about society during the time that we can see having effects on us here in the 21st century. So that's what this week's discussion is about. It's pretty open. As long as you're referring to your pieces, make sure that you're not just speculating about the time period, that you're rooting those back to the literature. So whenever you mention that the Romantics seem to be doing X, Y, Z, make sure that you can point to a piece of literature or a quote from a piece of literature in order to demonstrate that. Does that make sense? Any questions on discussion number 8? I don't know why it's not showing up on the discussion page. I will go back and check on that when we're finished with class today. So it's available for you. Okay, so let's talk about Earnest. Here it is right here. So you should have already looked at Act 1 and maybe Act 2. You might have read Act 2. It's not a hard read, but Act 2 obviously changes gears and moves into a different setting. And I wanted to touch on a couple of key concepts. I'm going to put them up on the screen here. This image that I have up here, so that we can refer back to it as we're thinking about Acts 1 and 2, is available for you in Blackboard. So you can go and get that if you want to save it into your Google Drive or have it on your screen while we're working today. I put it in additional materials, so it's right down here if you wanted to have your own copy, screenshot of that. But I think it's a good overview so that we can talk a little bit about what happened in Act 1 and move into Act 2, which we're going to watch today. Act 2 is the longest one. It's about 40 minutes. So I want to make sure that maybe I talk about it for 10 minutes and then get started with that, so I don't go over time today. But you should have been introduced to the main characters. Also, if you looked at the PDF that I presented to you, then that gave you an overview before you even started working with the play. But we have the main character of Jack Worthing, who also sometimes calls himself Earnest. When he's in the country, he's Jack. When he's in the city, he's Earnest. Earnest is completely made up. So he just gets bored with country life and wants to go into the city for a while. And he takes on a different name, a different persona. Same thing with his friend Algernon. Algernon Moncrief has this alter ego for when he goes to the country, and he's called Bunbury. So they discover in Act One that they're friends, but they both kind of do this thing where in the city I'm known as this kind of person, and in the country I'm known as that kind of person. And you can see that over here in concepts to track, city versus country. You're going to see that all over the place. For these two, identity is wrapped up in that because they have created two different personas. Now, that seems like a weird thing to do to our sensibilities here in 2021. I'm not going to disagree with that, but I think that what it points to is the idea that the aristocratic caste at this time in England didn't really have much to do. They didn't have to go and monitor their factories because they have managers for that. They were maybe given money through inheritance or titles or what have you, and they're not working every day like the working class or the poor. And so they have to find ways to occupy their time. And apparently, it was fun for them to create these different personas for the different places they went. They also created drama, and you'll see examples of that when we get into Act Two, and we see the confusion of Gwendolyn and Cecily in terms of who's Ernest and who's Jack and all that stuff. If you've already read Act Two, so the really the pastime was creating drama and trying to get married, and that's what they're involved and interested in. And Oscar Wilde is satirizing that. Everything is sort of like exaggerated in this play because he's trying to point out how stupid that is. Like, right, how self-absorbed it is to be so interested in these minute aspects of your society and creating these personas for yourself when there are people literally starving on the streets in London and children working in factories, and they're putting the bread and butter on your table. So Oscar Wilde is making these people almost farcical in their decisions to make these alter egos, partially to show how they haven't got anything to do, and in order to criticize that echelon of society. So Jack Worthing, as we see him in Act One, he's Ernest because he's in London, and he's in love with Gwendolyn Fairfax, or at least he wants to marry her. Love is another question. And he invites her out to his country estate. Her mother is Lady Bracknell, and he's trying to get her permission to marry Gwendolyn. And you'll notice that in the questioning in Act One, it's a little bit, kind of weird questions about what he believes in, and that's also mocking how people decided to get married in that strata of society. So Cecily Cardew is Jack when he's in the country, Jack's ward. And a ward is kind of like an orphan, or like a person that you're looking after who's not your own child. And her teacher is Miss Prism. There's also Dr. Chasuble. I didn't put him on here, but you'll see him here in Act Two. He's the country rector, the minister that's there. And he's only important because he flirts with Miss Prism, and also because they eventually do need to have some baptisms because there are questions about their names. Okay, so some things to be focusing on and making sure that you note about the satirical nature of this play. Marriage, I've already talked about that. Even in Act Two, you'll see Cecily, who has already engaged herself to Ernest, bought herself a ring, wears a bracelet that she imagines that he gave her, and wrote all these love letters. She's created this whole love affair and engagement that hasn't, with somebody who doesn't exist, A, and B, is unaware that she's even done that. So Oscar Wilde's making fun of how women sort of manage men into marriage. Social status, Victorian morality, and gender roles. So if the man is not going to work every day, what is his role? And we might consider some of the things that Jack and Algernon do as dandies, because if you looked at the description I sent you last week, they like to dress a certain way, and snappy bow ties and gloves, and they've got the right morning coat on, and they talk a little bit about fashion and all that stuff. And they're focused on those sorts of things, which is something that typically in history, women were more focused on appreciating and worrying about. There are some concepts to track. I think I've touched on almost all of them over here. So those are some things to keep in mind as we finish through Act 2 and into Act 3 for Thursday. Is there anything from Act 1 that you wanted me to talk about a little bit before we start watching Act 2? Because I'm just going to assume that you all already watched Act 1. It's better to go through literature in order. I don't see any questions popping up there in the chat. I do want to point out a point of the title just before we start Act 2, and that is the name Earnest. Earnest is a name, obviously, but it's also a character trait. So a person can be earnest because they're named Earnest, but a person can also be earnest just because of their behavior. Earnest means, you know, like honorable and seeking goodness. So it's a pun that Oscar Wilde is putting onto the play because most of the people in this play lie at some point or another, because Victorian sensibilities say that it's better to be clever than to be truthful. So he plays on that with the name Earnest. And both of the women in the play, Gwendolyn and Cecily, both really want to be married to somebody named Earnest because they think that it's just the best name ever. And then when they find out that the man that they're engaged to, lots of air quotes today, is not named Earnest, they're sort of disappointed. And like, I wanted to marry a man named Earnest. And so that just shows the shallowness of their decision making. Oscar Wilde's trying to show us all of that. All right, I don't see anything in the chat from Act 1, so today I'm going to play Act 2 for you, and it's about 40 minutes. So we're going to go till just about time to finish for today. Act 3 is for Thursday, so you will find that on the PDF. All right, let me turn off my...
So you'll see right here, this is Algernon. And right here is the moment where he writes down, secretly writes down the address that Ernest / Jack over here is trying to give to Gwendolyn. Gwendolyn is his love interest. He wants to marry her. And here she is. He's giving her his address so she'll come visit him in the country. And Algernon is secretly writing it down so that he can go out there and cause some drama by pretending to be the brother Earnest. And we'll see how that plays out here in Act 2.
Yes, Miss Prism? Cecily! Come here at once, child. We should have been at our labours quite 20 minutes ago, Cecily. Unfortunately, I was detained by a slight mishap to my oh, well, never mind that yet. Your German grammar is on the table. But I don't like German. It isn't at all a becoming language. I know perfectly well that I look quite plain after my German. Oh, child, you know how anxious your guardian is that you should improve yourself in every day. He laid particular stress on your German as he was leaving for